There is a standard explanation for how cities grow. A settlement forms. People arrive. Trade develops. Population increases. And then, gradually, incrementally, administration follows. Courts are built. Record offices open. Post systems are established. The bureaucracy grows to meet the city it serves. This is the accepted sequence. It is logical. It is intuitive. And for most of recorded history, it is exactly what the evidence appears to show. Until you look at the dates. Because in dozens of cases across the 19th century, across multiple continents, across unconnected regions with no apparent coordination between them, the administrative infrastructure arrived first. Not after the population. Not alongside it. Before it. Sometimes years before. Sometimes by decades. And the gap, in several cases, is not a matter of poor record-keeping or ambiguous dating. The gap is measurable. The gap is documented. And the gap is consistent enough that it begins to raise a question that standard historical frameworks do not resolve cleanly. This video explores historical interpretations and unanswered questions found in existing records. It does not present definitive conclusions. Let us begin with what the official record tells us. The 19th century was an era of extraordinary administrative expansion. Empires were growing. Colonial territories were being formalized. New nations were forming their governmental identities. It was, historians broadly agree, the great age of bureaucracy, the moment when the modern state learned to organize itself on paper, in stone, and across wires. Post offices, customs houses, courts of record, land registries, census bureaus. These were the instruments of governance, and their construction across the 1800s is well documented and widely studied. The standard interpretation is straightforward. Governments built administrative systems because growing populations and expanding economies demanded them. Supply responding to demand. Infrastructure following need. That is the model. And for a portion of the evidence, the model holds. But then there are the other cases. And the other cases do not fit comfortably. Consider the general pattern that emerges when researchers begin cross-referencing construction dates with population records in newly established administrative centers of the mid-19th century. In multiple regions, across North America, across Eastern Europe, across parts of Central Asia, large-scale administrative buildings were constructed, staffed, and formally opened during periods when the surrounding population was, by the same official records, extremely sparse. Not growing. Not arriving. Sparse. The buildings were not modest. They were not provisional. They were built at a scale that implied a future population that had not yet materialized. Courts with chambers for proceedings that, at the time of construction, were occurring perhaps once a month, if that. Post offices with sorting rooms larger than the entire residential footprint of the surrounding settlement. Land registry buildings with filing capacity for tens of thousands of parcels, in regions where land grants at the time of opening numbered in the hundreds. The question is not whether the populations eventually arrived to fill these spaces. In many cases they did. The question is why the infrastructure was sized and positioned for that future population before there was any reliable indication the population would come. Standard historical explanations offer several answers to this. One is optimism. 19th century planners, particularly in colonial and frontier contexts, were famously forward-thinking. They built for the future they expected, not the present they occupied. This is documented behavior. The transcontinental railroad logic applies here. Infrastructure precedes development because infrastructure is what enables development. This is a reasonable argument. It is applied consistently by historians, and it explains a portion of the pattern. A second explanation is centralized planning pressure. Imperial governments frequently imposed standardized construction programs on their territories regardless of local need. A building of a prescribed type was to be constructed in a settlement of a prescribed category, full stop. The actual population was secondary to the administrative taxonomy. This too is documented. There are archives full of standardized building orders issued from capital cities to colonial administrators who sometimes wrote back noting that the building, while completed, was serving almost no one. These explanations are not wrong. They are the accepted framework. but they leave something unresolved. Because the pattern, when examined not in isolation but in aggregate, carries a consistency that neither optimism nor standardized planning fully accounts for. It is not simply that administrative buildings appeared before populations. It is the degree of preparation, the specificity of it, the way in which, in case after case, the systems installed were not generic placeholder structures. They were functional. They were equipped. They were staffed with trained personnel who, in many documented instances, had arrived before there was meaningful work for them to perform. A customs house on a river crossing that, at the time of its opening, was processing fewer than a dozen shipments per month, but was built with vaulted storage, multiple inspection rooms, and a staff of 14. A regional court building in a settlement of 300 people, constructed with a public gallery seating over 200, a library of legal precedents and formalized procedural chambers. A post office in a plains settlement, opened with full sorting infrastructure, international routing capacity, and a postmaster appointed by a distant central authority before the first permanent residential structure in the surrounding district had been completed. Each of these individually can be filed under optimism, under standardized templates, under imperial planning logic. Together they form something that feels like more than planning. They feel like anticipation. Specific, detailed, well-resourced anticipation of a future that, in many cases, arrived almost exactly as dimensioned. And this is where the discomfort enters. Not through accusation, not through any claim about intent, but through a simpler, harder question. When an administration is built to govern a population that does not yet exist, built at the precise scale required, in the precise location required, with the precise functional capacity that will eventually be needed, what does that say about what was known and when? The scale mismatches are not the anomaly. The accuracy of the scale mismatches might be. Official history is not silent on this. But it is, in certain specific areas, notably quiet. The records exist. The dates are there. The construction logs are archived. And when they are placed beside the population records, beside the settlement timelines, beside the economic activity logs of the same periods, the sequence does not always run in the direction we expect. Administration followed cities. Except when it didn't. And the cases where it didn't are not rare enough to be dismissed as exceptions. They are common enough to be a pattern. And patterns, unlike anomalies, require explanations. The pattern does not stay in one place. That is the first thing researchers notice when they begin pulling administrative records across different continents, different political systems, different centuries of colonial expansion. The phenomenon is not regional. It is not the product of one empire's planning philosophy or one government's particular enthusiasm for forward construction. It repeats. Across geographies that had no administrative connection to each other. Across time periods separated by decades. Across cultures with entirely different bureaucratic traditions. And it repeats with a specificity that makes the repetition harder to explain away. The United States provides some of the most documented examples. The federal postal system is a well-studied institution, and its expansion westward across the 19th century is recorded in considerable archival detail. What those archives show, when examined alongside census data and settlement records, is a timing sequence that does not consistently follow the expected logic. In multiple territories, across the Great Plains, across the Mountain West, across portions of the Mississippi Corridor, federal post offices were established, staffed, and operationally opened in advance of the residential populations they were designated to serve. Not by weeks. In documented cases, by years. Post roads were surveyed and formally designated through territories where, at the time of designation, there were no permanent settlements along significant stretches of the route. The standard explanation, again, is infrastructure-led development. Build the road, the settlers follow. Designate the postal route, the communities form around the stops. This logic is applied uniformly. It is the dominant framework in frontier history scholarship. But the postal infrastructure is only one layer. Beneath it and alongside it, federal land offices were established, buildings staffed with surveyors, registrars, and administrative personnel, in locations where, at the time of opening, land transactions were occurring at a rate far below the operational capacity of the installed system. Regional federal courthouses were constructed to full judicial specification in territories with populations that would not require that level of judicial infrastructure for another decade or more. Customs infrastructure appeared along river routes and territorial borders with a thoroughness that, given the actual volume of trade at the time, reads as significantly oversized. Each piece fits the infrastructure-first explanation. The aggregate raises a more uncomfortable question. Why was every piece oversized in the same direction at the same time, to roughly the same degree of excess? The United Kingdom presents a different context but a structurally similar pattern. In the mid to late 19th century, the British government undertook a sweeping reform and expansion of its municipal administrative systems. New town halls were built across England. Record offices were established. Civil registration infrastructure, tracking births, deaths, marriages, was rolled out at a national scale following the 1837 Registration Act and its subsequent expansions. The official account of this process is well documented and largely uncontested. The reforms were a response to industrialization, urbanization, and the administrative chaos that came with rapid population growth in manufacturing centers. But the timing in certain specific cases invites examination. Several of the largest municipal administrative buildings constructed during this period were completed and formally opened in towns whose population growth, according to the same census records used to justify the construction, had not yet reached the levels that were cited as the justification. Buildings were opened ready, staffed, equipped with record-keeping infrastructure at a scale that, by the population figures of the opening year, was operating well below design capacity. In some cases, this excess capacity was absorbed within a generation. The cities grew into their administrative frameworks. In others, the growth never fully arrived. The administrative infrastructure remains, in certain towns, larger than the population it currently serves, a permanent architectural artifact of a projected future that came only partially. Beyond the United States and United Kingdom, the pattern appears in the administrative expansion of the Russian Empire across Central Asia. It appears in the formalization of colonial administrative centers in sub-Saharan Africa. It appears in the structured bureaucratic development of the Austro-Hungarian frontier territories. In each context, local historians have noted, sometimes in passing, sometimes with more sustained attention, the curious tendency of governance to precede the governed. What makes these instances worth examining together is not that any single one of them is inexplicable in isolation. Every individual case has a local explanation. Frontier optimism, imperial standardization, centralized planning mandates handed down without regard for ground-level conditions. The question is not whether local explanations exist. The question is whether local explanations are sufficient when the pattern is this consistent, this geographically dispersed, and this structurally similar across administrative traditions that had no direct connection to one another. There is another dimension to this that the standard framework tends to address only briefly. The personnel. Buildings are one thing. A large building can be explained as architectural ambition, as political signaling, as a misaligned budget cycle. These are mundane explanations. They are not unreasonable. But the administrative buildings of the 19th century, the ones that arrived before their populations, were not empty. They were staffed. And the staffing in documented cases was not provisional or skeleton crew. It was functional. Trained personnel. Specialists. In some instances, personnel with qualifications that would have taken years to develop, brought in, formally appointed, and placed in operational roles within administrative systems that had little immediate work to perform. A land registry office does not function with a single clerk. It requires surveyors who understand the local geography, registrars trained in the applicable legal framework, administrators capable of managing complex documentation systems. These people do not appear overnight. Their presence, before the population they were meant to serve had arrived, implies a lead time of preparation that precedes even the construction dates. Which means the planning, wherever it originated, began earlier than the buildings suggest. And here the pattern acquires a quality that purely logistical explanations struggle to fully address. This was not planning for a city. This was planning for a functioning administrative organism, with its internal hierarchies, its specialist roles, its procedural infrastructure, inserted into landscapes that were, by official record, not yet ready to require it. Some historians note this and move on. The frontier logic explanation absorbs it. But a smaller number of researchers working across different disciplines, historical geography, archival studies, infrastructure history, have begun examining these cases not in isolation but in constellation, looking not at why any single system appeared early, but at what it means that so many systems across so many unconnected regions appear to have been built according to a similar logic of anticipation. Some of these researchers, in their attempts to describe the pattern they are observing, have reached for a term, not as a conclusion, not as a historical claim, but as a kind of shorthand for a set of questions that existing frameworks have not fully resolved. The term is starting to appear in these discussions with increasing frequency. And what it points toward is not a simple answer. It is a more complicated set of questions. The word appears in academic papers cautiously. In online research communities, it appears constantly, sometimes with extraordinary confidence, sometimes with serious qualification, sometimes as little more than a provocative header above a collection of photographs and dates. It appears in the titles of self-published investigations, in the footnotes of more careful archival studies, and increasingly in the work of researchers who are not making claims so much as organizing observations that existing frameworks have left without a comfortable home. The word is Tartaria. And before examining what researchers mean when they use it in this specific context, it is worth being precise about what the term is not, because precision here matters more than almost anywhere else in this discussion. Tartaria in the historical record is not a mystery. It is a real geographic designation. European cartographers from the medieval period onward used Tartaria, or Tataria, depending on the source, as a broad territorial label for the vast interior of the Eurasian continent. It appeared on maps. It was used in diplomatic correspondence. It described, loosely, the regions associated with the successor cultures of the Mongol Empire, Central Asia, Siberia, portions of what is now Russia and China. It was never a single political entity with defined borders. It was a cartographic convenience, a label for a large, imperfectly understood interior. This is the historical record. It is not contested. It is not hidden. It is available in any serious atlas collection, in any university archive with access to early modern European cartography. When contemporary researchers use the term Tartaria in the context being examined here, they are using it differently. And it is important to understand how. In contemporary alternative history and historical anomaly research, Tartaria has become a term, not universally accepted, not academically formalized but increasingly used, to describe a pattern rather than a place. Specifically, some researchers use it as shorthand for the hypothesis that the administrative and architectural infrastructure of the 19th century reflects the remnants or continuations of a prior organizational system, one whose origins, scale, and timeline do not map cleanly onto the standard historical narrative of how cities, nations, and governance structures develop from the ground up. This is one interpretation. It is held with varying degrees of conviction by different researchers. Some treat it as a serious structural hypothesis about the archaeology of governance. Others treat it as a useful organizing frame for anomalies that they believe deserve more systematic study. Others approach it with significant skepticism, using the label not because they endorse the hypothesis but because it has become the common vocabulary around a set of questions they are engaging with critically. It is not a unified theory. It does not have a single agreed definition even among those who use it. What it has is a set of recurring observations that it is applied to describe. The observations, as they relate to administrative infrastructure specifically, run as follows. If the administrative systems that appeared before their populations were not built in anticipation of growth, but were instead the continuation or adaptation of systems that already existed in some prior organizational form, then the timeline anomalies are not anomalies at all. They are artifacts. Evidence not of forward planning but of backward integration. New political entities inheriting, occupying, or reformatting administrative frameworks that were already in place and already sized for the populations they would come to govern. This interpretation does not require any specific claim about who built the prior systems, or when or why records of them are limited. It requires only the observation that the sequence, administration before population, is more consistent with inheritance than with anticipation. Some researchers find this interpretation more parsimonious than the alternatives. If you need to explain, in case after case, why planners built administrative systems at scales that proved almost exactly correct for populations that had not yet arrived, one answer is that they were very good at planning. Another answer is that they already knew the scale because the scale was not their invention. A second, more cautious interpretation holds that the pattern is real but does not require a prior civilization to explain it. What it may reflect, these researchers argue, is the degree to which 19th century governance was more centralized, more coordinated, and more deliberately systematic than popular historical accounts tend to emphasize. Not a hidden prior order, but a visible, documented order, imperial, colonial, federal, that operated according to logics of territorial control rather than organic development, and whose physical outputs therefore look, in retrospect, less like growth and more like installation. Under this interpretation, the administrative buildings that preceded their populations were not remnants. They were instruments, tools of territorial claim. Infrastructure deployed to establish administrative reality before demographic reality had materialized, because, for the governments deploying it, administrative reality was the point. Population was secondary. Governance was the act of assertion. This interpretation sits comfortably within mainstream historical scholarship. It is not a fringe position. It is, in many respects, simply a more clear-eyed account of how empire actually functions. The reason it still leaves something unresolved is the precision problem. Instruments of territorial assertion do not need to be correctly sized for populations that arrive decades later. They need to be present, legible, politically meaningful. A customs house the size of a garden shed would accomplish the territorial assertion. The vaulted ceilings, the filing capacity for tens of thousands of parcels, the trained staff of 14. These details are not explained by assertion logic. They are explained by anticipation logic, or by something else. A third interpretation, held by a smaller number of researchers and generally regarded with more skepticism by archival historians, suggests that the pattern points towards something in the historical record that has not yet been adequately studied, not because it has been deliberately obscured, but because the questions being asked of the record are relatively new. Archival history, like any discipline, has its established lines of inquiry and its neglected ones. The question of why administrative infrastructure preceded population in so many 19th century cases has not historically been a central research focus. It has been absorbed into larger narratives, of empire, of frontier development, of industrial modernization, without being examined on its own terms. Some researchers argue that when it is examined on its own terms, what emerges is a set of questions about continuity that the standard periodization of history, the clean breaks between empires, the formal founding dates of nations, the official establishment dates of institutions, does not fully account for. They are not claiming falsification. They are noting gaps. Gaps between what the records show and what the accepted frameworks explain. None of these interpretations is the same as a conclusion. A conclusion would require a standard of evidence that none of the researchers working in this space, regardless of where they sit on the spectrum from mainstream scholarship to alternative hypothesis, currently possesses. What they have instead are patterns. Documented, measurable, geographically distributed patterns in the timing and scale of administrative construction. Patterns that generate questions more readily than they generate answers. The label Tartaria, for those who use it in this context, is not an answer to those questions. It is a marker. A way of saying, here is a cluster of observations that existing frameworks have not fully absorbed, and we have named the cluster so that we can continue examining it. Whether the cluster, on closer examination, resolves into a familiar historical explanation, optimism, empire, assertion, coordinated planning, or into something that requires a more fundamental reconsideration of the sequence by which the modern administrative world came to exist, is a question that the current state of the research does not resolve. The buildings are still standing. The dates are still in the archives. And the populations, in case after case, arrived almost exactly when and where the infrastructure had been waiting for them. Whether someone planned that, or whether something else entirely was already in place before the planning began, remains for now an open question.